Preacher's Dilemma. I wrote this sermon Wednesday, Thursday, and then played with the commas yesterday. And it's not bad. But this morning when I arrived, there was a houseless person asleep under the entryway at the front of the church. And it was a mess. And she was clearly confused and lonesome and quite at sea. So since then, it's been maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30, experienced that. And ever since then, the preacher's dilemma is, how would I have written this sermon differently had I experienced that before and not after? So in addition to all of the questions I may be asking in this sermon, I ask each of you to consider the words that I've written, because they're not bad. They're truth, my truth, God's truth. But how might we consider these words in light of the woman who was asleep in our doorway amid trash, broken glass, and remnants of food? Grace, mercy, and peace to you from the triune God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. The gospel talks today about two of Jesus' encounters at the start of his ministry. At first, these two stories may not seem to have much in common. The first is about hungry disciples walking through a wheat field, gathering heads of grain as they went. The second tells of Jesus' encounter in the synagogue with a man who has a withered hand. But an important thread ties these two stories together. You see, both occur on the Sabbath, and therein lies the drama. In the first, Jesus and his disciples plucked heads of green grain as they were walking through the fields on that day. Now, their stomachs did not know it was the Sabbath, and their stomachs did not know, as they cut through that field and stripping of its bounty, that was prohibited by rabbinic law. These people were simply hungry, and their bodies needed nourishment to live. Now, Jesus understands that hungry people have a right to food, despite laws that might restrict such access. But the Pharisees, who had plenty to eat every other day of the week, and who probably had plenty in their storerooms, and who could afford to fast without endangering themselves, well, the Pharisees were aghast. And then we're told Jesus healed a man with a withered hand, also on the Sabbath. Now, this man's condition kept him from working, forcing him into begging, a way of life in ancient Palestine that pushed him to the margins of society. Now, Jesus not only restored the use of this man's hand, but returned him, in so doing, to a livelihood and a way to resume a productive, if yet meager, life. Not only could this man now earn some money in order to eat, however inadequate those meals might have been, but now he could also be seen by the larger community as whole once again. No longer shunned in his disability, he might be able to resume a place in society. But again, this growing religious sect of the Pharisees that focused on literal interpretation of the law had plenty, enough to share and probably share, enough to spare and share, and who were at the center of power and prestige. Well, those guys, they were horrified that Jesus would heal on the Sabbath. Now, it's not as though Jesus wasn't a good and faithful Jew who studied and observed Torah. The laws given in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy are valuable laws. They give us a roadmap, if you will, guideposts necessary to teach us how we ought to relate to one another and how we ought to relate to God. And Jesus most certainly knew that third commandment, observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. The prescribed first-century behavior around keeping the Sabbath meant you were not to do any work. You or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or young donkey or any of your livestock or the resident alien in your towns. God, Yahweh, is clear about the requirements for Sabbath rest. Parenthetically, he should be us. But he's clear about Sabbath rest. And yet, Jesus broke the rules about the Sabbath. Not once, but twice. Jesus' intention is clear. In both incidents, Jesus helps others. He breaks Sabbath, that was pretty darn shocking in his context, for the great purpose of helping others and not for his own benefit. And yet the Pharisees are absolutely horrified that Jesus would cast aside Mosaic law, as he did this morning, in order to grant people necessary nourishment or life-giving healing. In today's gospel, we see this radical, troublemaking Jesus turning the world order upside down. We're reading from chapter 2 in the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest of the Gospels to be written, and already we are seeing the seeds of the ruling society's discontent with this upstart itinerant preacher. This is a watershed moment in the Gospels. Jesus is choosing life, healing the disabled man, and feeding the hungry. Could it be that the religious officials are choosing death, plotting against Jesus as he continues his healing work in clear opposition from the authorities? We're not yet a fifth of the way through Mark's chronicle, and already Jesus is being marked for death. In Jesus, we see the divine gift of grace played out in down-to-earth, practical ways that promote life. But as German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminds us, this is also costly grace. The Pharisees are so connected to the law and their way of life that they have forgotten that their actions ought to be guided by mercy, kindness, and compassion. Guiding principles that one might argue ought to outweigh everything else. They have forgotten one of the most fundamental characteristics of God, our holy beloved, and that is defined by the Hebrew word hesed. There is no easy one-to-one translation of the word hesed, but Bible scholar Darrell Bach writes, hesed is wrapping up itself in all the positive attributes of God: love, covenant, faithfulness, mercy, grace, kindness, loyalty. In short, acts of devotion and loving kindness that go far beyond the requirements of duty. It's a really tall order to live and behave at all times by this biblical concept of hesed. Never perfect, and we do not live our lives in a vacuum. We live in a world of government and politics and labor and messy relationships. Now, I am not an anarchist, but I do really believe in right and wrong, good and evil. But the fact is, we live our lives in the messy in-between places, between strictly adhering to the law of God in all situations on one extreme, and the self-giving way of life shown to us by the Holy One on the other. And our work as Christians and as responsible citizens of the world is to determine our best course of action as we are faced with the gray areas of life each and every day. So, questions. How might we be guided in negotiating our life's behavior when it seems to conflict to the strict adherence of God's law? When do we look only to the Torah for our instruction manual? Do we act in accordance with the gospel mandate of grace and compassion, with the biblical concept of Hesed? What responses are the right ones and are reflective of Creator God? And through the centuries, we are invited, we are commanded, just about, to wrestle with a paradox. How is it that Jesus seems to both defy the traditions of the Torah that reflect the authority of God, while at the same time acting with the authority of God? The work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer might help. I read Bonhoeffer to go to sleep at night. Bonhoeffer maintains words like morality, good, and evil get tossed around by philosophers and the rest of us as if everyone knew precisely what it was that we were talking about when we said those words. Now, we could argue about definitions all day long of good, evil, morality, but Bonhoeffer insists that rather than concern ourselves with those definitions, proper Christian ethical reflection and subsequent action concerns itself with the will of God, sought and lived anew every day. He writes, "The will of God is not a system of rules which is established from the outset. It is something new and different in each and every different situation in our lives. And for this reason, a person must ever anew examine what the will of God may be." Ultimately, he reasons we must rely solely upon the grace of God, a grace that is and requires us to be new every moment of every day. It is no longer a matter of person's own knowledge of good and evil, but only a living will of God to which we must be concerned. The living will of God must guide our path, and this is exactly what our rule-defying Messiah has done. I urge you to search your hearts deeply for the will of God each and every moment of each and every day. But how do we begin to uncover the will of God? I wonder if it's often presumptuous of us to ever think we could understand the will of God. But there is an old Jewish text from the 9th century that might guide us. The rabbi teaches that every person is accompanied at all times by a procession of angels, crying out, "Make way, for an image of the Holy One is approaching." Each person just like royalty. After all, what else do we want, each one of us, other than to love and to be loved in our families, in our work, in our relationships, in our community, and throughout the world? How do we treat people in such a way that we truly believe we will never, ever look into the eyes of another, of someone that God does not love? During this time in which we are evaluating who we are as a congregation and dream about our ways our mission might be brought out into the world, Wonder with me what it would mean to build a community around us in which we remember God made us and everything in the world in God's holy image. Trained our hearts to see the divinity in people we may have previously considered invisible. How would this affect our relationships with our neighbors, our coworkers, the stranger lying beneath the stained blankets outside a church door, the trash outside that McDonald's on the corner of Burnside and 19th? Would that honest assessment compel us to recast the cultures of our schools, our organizations, our faith communities? How would viewing the divine image in everyone and everything around us impact healthcare, education, public policy, and even law enforcement? How would it impact the judgments rendered based on the color of our skin, our economic position, our age, our ableist orientations, our gender or sexual orientation? People of God, if we renew our commitment to recognize the living will of God in each moment, won't our world be one in which we recognize and fight for each other's dignity and well-being? As we grow together as a people of God, while considering our ministry in this very broken world, let's resolve to stop missing the signs of all those angels trumpeting their proclamations of the goodness of each other. Holy God, you are Lord of the Sabbath. Help us to serve you. Give us ears to hear and open our hearts to embrace your ways. Let's allow the will of God to melt our hearts so that we may spread the good news to the world around us.